All right, chapter 7, we are on selection. And that is, we've now recruited people. We've got all the way down to kind of that second to last stage where we have applicants and we want to basically vet them. And the outcome of this process is we'll have kind of a rank order of who we want to give an offer to, and ultimately actually give them the offer. So that's kind of the agenda for the day. There's a lot of slides on this one. I cut out as many as I could, but there's a lot of kind of important stuff. But each of it it's not super complex, so we should be able to go through pretty quickly. Let me make this a little bit smaller here. There we go. Okay, so a couple of definitions. Selection, pretty straightforward. Choosing people who have the right qualifications and putting them in jobs. That's what it means to select somebody. There is a model called the attraction, selection, attrition model, and it predicts how culture is formed. So it kind of goes like this. A firm has a certain type of person. A certain type of person works at REI. A certain type of person works at Microsoft. You get the idea. It's their culture. And a certain type of person will be attracted to work there, probably similar to the people who are already working there. A certain type of person is selected to work there from those who are attracted. They are probably even more like the people who are already there. And then if they don't fit, a certain type of person will leave the company, which means who's left is the people who are already like the people who were there. So the ASA model basically shows how the continuation of culture happens, but right smack dab in the middle of that is selection. So when people talk about an HR professional being like a cultural architect, like changing the organization, one of the primary ways we do that is who we bring in the front door. That is who we hire. If we hire somebody who's like everybody else there, we will continue that culture for better or worse. And if we hire somebody different, if we can get them to stay, that will change the culture for better or for worse. So that's the ASA model. A few terms to know about. There are different types of fit. When we go to selection, the number one thing that we are looking at is not just hiring the smartest person or coolest person, but hiring the best fit for that job. That's the third bullet point down there. Person job fit basically means there's KSAs, the individual knowledge, skills, abilities, and there's TDRs of the job, task, duties, and requirements. To the extent that those fit, we say, hey, that was a good placement. Person job fit is probably the most important. The next one is person organization fit, and that is in an interview you might be asked questions about like what do you value and where do you see yourself in 5 years and blah blah, and they're trying to get the idea of, do you fit with our culture? When it's job specific questions, we are assessing person job fit, but then we might ask about them as an individual, and we're trying to see, do you value the things that we value? That's about person organization fit. Two different lines of question. Last one is person group fit. That one's pretty straightforward. A lot of times, one of the final stages of the interview process, the selection process, will be an interview with the team that you'd be working with. And that's to say, do we have a personality connection here, or is this going to be a problem? Yeah, they can do the job. They seem to align with our culture, but can they work with this group of people? All three of those are helpful. If you have them, excellent. So how do you know what to look for or what to ask about during the interview? So here's kind of a model. It works like this. On the far left, you can see this is what good job performance looks like on any given job. And all you do is try to get predictors all the way back to the things that you can interview for. So what predicts quality and quantity of work? Well, a couple of things are, does the person have ability and are they motivated? Okay, if we want someone with high ability and high motivation, what predicts that? Well, we found that this selection technique, or giving them a cognitive ability test, or past experience on the job, minimum of 3 years, typically shows motivation. So you're just kind of moving to the right until you can find things that you can ask about and find information on, valid information on, in the interview process. So on the far right, what we're going for in an interview is this predictors of selection criteria, and then we'll ask questions around that. That'll give us information on what are actually selection criteria. This is how we're going to make the decision to hire. And we assume and we hope if we've got good selection criteria, then they'll actually do well on the job. So at a broad level, this is kind of how we get, when you get a question, they all begin with, tell me about a time when, and I'll tell you why that is. But tell me about a time when you worked on a team. What did you do? So they believe that the answer to that question, that's a predictor of selection criteria. The answer to that question will be how the selection criteria, how well do you work in a team, which will contribute to good job performance. A few other terms to know about. We want to have both a reliable and a valid selection procedure. They're two different things. They both matter, but they're two different things. Any procedure, any selection test that we use needs to have both of these. Reliability just means it measures the same thing each time. So if I say, I make the decision, I ask people their favorite color, and if people say their favorite color is red, then I hire them because they're going to work out well. Well, that might be reliable. Like, you do measure the same thing every time, but it's not valid. It's not going to predict job performance very, very well. Job performance, obviously, on the job. So reliability, validity, both are important. And if you remember back when we talked about the EEO chapter, I talked about Griggs versus Duke Power. They didn't demonstrate validity in their test, and so they got sued and they lost. Both of these got to have. Sometimes it takes time to do that. Another source of validity is, let's say that you found in your truckers who are delivery drivers that someone who can lift more weight out of the truck to unload it tends to do better on the job. You can't just take that test and say we're going to hire based on that from now on. It actually happened to Dial Soap company, and they got sued and they lost. So you can't just take a test and start using it for selection. You have to make sure it's valid first. The two ways you do that are concurrent validity and predictive validity, and they look kind of like this, if you can see it. On the left, you have concurrent validity. That means I came up with this test. You have to lift 10 50-pound boxes of soap in an hour and move them 30 feet. I came up with that test. So I give them to all my current employees. I give that test to everybody who's already working there. Concurrent, with current employees, right? And if they do that test and I get their test scores, and the test scores show that people who did that test actually have better performance evaluations, then it looks like it's a good test. That's step one. Step two, I don't use that test to screen anybody out, but every person that I hire for 6 months, a year, whatever, I give them that test. They carry those, boxes of soap, 50 pounds, in 10 minutes or however long they have to do it. And I get those scores, and then 6 months later, I do a test. I do statistics, and I say, does the performance on those brand new employees, does the performance on that test predict how well they're doing on the job, their performance evaluations? If the answer is yes to both of those, meaning this test I came up with predicts performance in current employees and predicts performance for incoming employees, then at that point you can actually use that test to start selection, and it would be, in general, legally defensible. Okay, so let's say we have all these different tests for any particular job. They have to do a cognitive ability test, they have to do maybe a psychomotor test, they have to have this education, this experience, an on-the-job test, work sample, whatever it is. How do we know which one of those is the most important? Well, we run data, we find out which one predicts performance the best, but there's two ways that you can go about implementing it. One of them is, think of this like let's say somebody wants to be a Navy SEAL, okay? There's a lot of different tests to be a Navy SEAL. They combine these two things. A multiple hurdles approach means you have to run a mile in at least 7 minutes, you have to swim a quarter mile in at least this time, and you have to do 60 push-ups without stopping and 100 sit-ups without stopping. Each one of those are hurdles. So they may say that's the minimum. If you score below that on any one thing, you're out and you don't go on to the next phase. A compensatory approach would mean I'm going to take the scores from each one of those, standardize them, and then crank out one final, like an index of this employee's overall score on our test is 135. This employee's is 152, which means they did better on average on everything. Some institutions use both, like I talked about the Navy SEALs. You get a higher score if you can run a mile in 6 minutes, and that goes towards your final score. But if you can't run a mile in 7 minutes, you're out. So you can combine them as well when you have multiple kind of steps in the process. Another thing that we'd like to do, you remember early on we talked about the talked about the psychological contract. Right? We all come to work with this set of expectations about what will and won't happen, and a set of responsibilities that what we will do that we'll embrace with that. One of the ways during the selection process that we basically refine that, we go, hey man, this is what it's actually like on the job, is this. I talked about it before, but it's a realistic job preview. When you bring someone in for an interview, especially if they're a finalist, maybe it's the final interview, you want to take them to where they will be sitting, or take them to meet the people they will be working with, or show them the building, show them the cafeteria, let them see the commute, stuff like that, so they get a real idea of what it's like. In the long run, it refines the psychological contract, and it's very good to find out then that someone goes, man, I can't work here. Then 6 months later, when they say this place is sucking the life out of me, I'm going to quit, after you put all that money into them and you have to start all over from scratch. So that's a realistic job review. Very helpful if you can do it. Okay, the application. So think of it like this. What we are trying to get from people is information that we can use to make the decision of if we should hire them. So if I'm in an interview and the conversation comes up about spouses, or where you grew up, or, oh my gosh, politics and religion. I've heard horror stories and seen some of them. Whatever comes up, just assume the employee will believe that that's going to be used in the process, right? So you interview someone, they ask about your spouse, or does he or she work around here or whatever, and you say, oh no, my wife and I recently split up, and then you don't get the job. Well, you would think the reason you didn't get the job is because of the comment about marriage, not that you weren't qualified. So there are certain things we don't ask about. Here's a list of them. You can see them. They're all pretty straightforward. We don't ask about them only because that leads the candidate to believe, well, obviously they use this. Even if it comes up in conversation, obviously they used it when making the decision. So it's much more of a pure process. Just stick with whatever's job related, ignore everything else. On the resume, you can't control what they put on the resume. If it's there, it's there. We accept resumes even if it's not on our formal application process. Per the EEOC, the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, resumes are considered applications. So if somebody says you a resume for a specific job, vet it. You can tell them, hey, go fill out our application. That's fine. Or to be considered, you need to fill out our application. But for all intents and purposes, that is an employment record. It needs to be hung on to for about 3 years. As a reminder, the Immigration Reform Control Act, it was 1986, IRCA, I-R-C-A, says that you have to verify 2 things within the first 72 hours of employment. That is work authorization. They're legally authorized to work in the United States. It's not citizenship. There's a lot of ways to be authorized to work. And the second is identity. They are who they say they are. All right, that's IRCA. Personality test. You've probably taken whatever, Myers-Briggs or a Big 5 or Enneagram or StrengthsFinder. Geez, there's a million of them at this point. Some of them are complete garbage, but some of them are okay. So this one has been around for quite a while. The Big 5 personality test is probably the most respected, just in terms of having validity, in terms of what's called predictive validity and construct validity. It goes like this. Barrick and Mount, I believe, researchers, 1991, they took we were only bounded by our language, right? So every word that described a human had some theory behind it. And so they crunched them all together and said, hey, look, like resilience and grit and toughness and hardiness, those are all kind of the same thing. They can fit in a category. And they whittled it down to, I don't know what it was, 30, 40 categories, and then they whittled those categories down to make 5. And their argument is basically every personality trait has some connection to or fits somewhere in these 5 dimensions of personality: extroversion, agreeableness, conscientiousness, neuroticism, and openness to experience. And each of them predict different types of things, and some of them even predict performance on jobs. So extroversion predicts leader emergence, so who will become a leader. It doesn't exactly predict leadership effectiveness, if they'll be good, but it says who will emerge. Conscientiousness. that has what's called generalized coefficient validity, meaning conscientiousness predicts who's going to be good at almost any job. More conscientious people, like in my head, this is an engineer and accountant, right? I'm neither. They just always seem like they're always just good at stuff. So someone who's highly conscientious, right? They keep their task list, they turn things in on time, they follow the syllabus perfectly, and they ask questions politely, and they sincerely student, and they call me Dr. AV, and I'm like, okay, yeah, you're going to take over the world. Good for you. That's a conscientious person. A lot of firms will use that on personality tests. And it's so funny to listen to people that take personality tests. They're like, oh yeah, I took this test and I knew what they were asking. So I clicked the right answers. No, you didn't. There's a thing called item response theory. There's a whole community of crazy smart statisticians who, if it's a good test, design tests so they're not really fakeable. It's like an honesty test. You know, nobody says, hey, you wouldn't steal from the company, would you? I mean, they're all, anyway, we can get to that. If you're interested in that, you can get a hold of me. You're not really going to fake one of those tests. Very popular in terms of like sales or jobs that involve working with the public, especially working with children. Insurance companies are big on using different predictors, like personality kind of predictors to how well people do in the insurance industry. So they use a lot of this stuff. And each one will kind of predict things differently, right? Like neuroticism, you want it to be really low. Openness to experience, if you're hiring an artist or somebody who's in marketing, you probably want that to be high. If it's in customer service, you want someone to be really agreeable, highly agreeable. If someone is a safety engineer at a nuclear plant to make sure it doesn't blow up, you don't want them to be agreeable. You want them to be suspicious. You want that person to be cranky because you don't want any mistakes. So if I'm hiring that engineer, I'm looking for crazy high conscientiousness and below average agreeableness. I want them to be cranky and not make any mistakes. You don't want that person to be at the call service desk for Visa or Sprint, right? Super bad person to have there. So anyway, we can give personality tests. They predict well on jobs. There's another field. I only bring this up, emotional intelligence, because I think it's popular. People love it, and people have just like hooked onto it like it's this beautiful thing. From a scientific perspective, it may or may not even exist. And what I mean by that is measurement of it is really poor. Face validity of the measurements is poor. What's called psychometric analysis usually don't produce good data, meaning like there's something to this, right? This emotional intelligence thing, there's something to it. And I don't care how many books somebody writes, Goleman or Emotional Intelligence 2.0, whatever, they're great books, and I think they're hitting on something really good. But our ability to measure it accurately and then use it in a selection context is really limited at this point. It might change in the future. But pointed out to say you may get a test, it may be an emotional intelligence test. I don't recommend using them, usually because they're pretty unreliable. But there are different factors, right? So 4 factors of emotional intelligence. Self-awareness. I call this of like, are you on planet Earth? Right? When I meet the 14-year-old kid that doesn't have enough coordination to play any sport and tells me that they're going to the NBA, I'm like, yeah, I live on planet Earth. Like, have we met? So self-awareness, social awareness. Do you understand what's happening in kind of the group environment? Do you understand how people are feeling? Self-management. Can you regulate? It's called self-regulation. Can you regulate your behavior and how you're displaying those emotions to convey certain meaning? And of course, relationship management. So each of these 4 are kind of a component of emotional intelligence. That's how it's used in kind of a typical manager, practitioner, or what I call an airport book kind of environment. Like, hey, these are the 4 things you need to do to be a good leader. No, it doesn't work that way. Leadership is too contextual for that. But each of these things are good. You can just look at them and go, yeah, why not? Each of those things would be good. And they are. They're difficult to measure. You may get this if you're going through a selection procedure. Okay, so those are the tests, right? And somebody will get some kind of score on the test, and then we actually get into interviews. And there's kind of 2 categories of interviews. One of them is good, and one of them is not so good. As you can imagine, the good, the valid way, the respected way, the legal way to do interviews is a little bit more difficult and a little more inconvenient than the easy way, which is less valid. So we have structured interviews. Most of us have experienced this and will continue to do so. In a structured interview, everybody gets the same questions, same format, probably in the same room, probably around the same time of day, as much consistency as possible. So the only variance is in the candidate's responses. Because really, when you're going to evaluate a candidate, if it's 9 o'clock in the morning right after coffee and you're pumped and ready to go for the day, you're going to evaluate them differently than if it's 5:30 at night and you're exhausted and you just want to go home. So as much consistency about the context, the order of the questions, who reads the questions, stuff like that, we like that to be as consistent as possible. And that ensures that you're actually just evaluating what the candidates themselves said. Now that's great, but it can feel like you're handcuffed a little bit when you're doing the interview because they say something and you're like, oh man, I really wanted to ask about that thing they said, but that wasn't part of our structure. That's a limitation. And best not to break it, because if you ask this person this extra question, how do you know what the last person would have said? Maybe they had an even better response or a better story or a cool experience that you didn't ask about. So you try to like as much consistency there as possible. There's a few different types of interviews, structured interviews. Most of the time, what we use is a combination of a behavioral interview and a situational interview. A situational interview is like you think about the job that they're going to be doing, and you say, let's think about some common situations that come up on this job, and let's ask them, hey, what would you do in a situation like this? As you can imagine, those questions are not great, because if you ask me, like, what would I do in a situation, I can almost always give you the right answer. That doesn't mean I'm actually going to do it, right? A behavioral interview asks about how you've performed, certain types of tasks or whatever in the past. That's what you did, what the candidate actually did. The reason that a behavioral interview is necessary is because we know that on average, the best predictor of future behavior is past behavior. It doesn't mean that people can't change. It just means that people usually don't change, right? We can tell what they're going to do by what they've done. So what we do is we combine these. We try to think of situations that are on the job, make them as general as possible, and then transition that to a behavioral interview. So if I'm working on a team, if I'm hiring for a job and the job is working on some kind of a team, right? One of my behavioral interview questions might be, can you tell me about a time when you worked on a team and it went well? Or can you tell me about a time when you worked on a team and it was a dysfunctional team? Because that happens, right? So you see, I'm trying to combine the two. Ask the question that's as closely related to the job as possible, but in a way it's general enough to where pretty much every candidate could respond to it. We combine those, and it allows us to compare everybody kind of equally on those questions. How many questions? I don't know. It depends on the nature of the interview. Usually after about an hour, people are pretty spent. And I found that depending on, like, at least in professional interviews that I do, there are 8 questions maybe, somewhere between 6 and 10 questions. And you'll be able to read the room and tell right away. But if you start with 10 questions to the first interviewer and you're like, man, that took an hour and a half. Well, guess what? All of your interviews are going to be an hour and a half because you can't back off at that point and change the questions. So it's super important to agree on the front end what you will and you won't ask. Unstructured interview, I don't want to talk about it because I don't want you to think it's a good idea. It's not valid. It's not defendable. And if you are being hired at a company and you go through that process and you're there and you have credibility with the leadership team, maybe tell them, hey, you need to tweak your interview procedure. I had HRM 381, so I know how to do it. Yes. Who conducts the interviews? Individual managers, hiring managers, HR people often do the front end to kind of screen out people who aren't going to fit. You do individuals sequentially. So you meet with the hiring manager, then you meet with maybe a team lead, and then if it all goes good from there, maybe you meet with a senior manager, and that's it for the day. Panel interviews of people from different areas in the company. Of course, team interviews, in theory, is the team that you would be working with. All of them can be helpful. Are you going to do all of them as an HR person, as a manager? No, it's insane. It would take way too much work. What you want to do is say, who is the best person to ask the questions, who knows the job well, who can respond to the candidate's questions, right? And how do we balance the need for the candidate to see more and us to get better information from them with our need to actually work on the job versus spending all of our day during the hiring process. Problems in the interview. This, every time I look at this slide, it reminds me. I have a buddy. I will not say his first and last name because I think we still contact from time to time, and I want you to find him. So he's an Arab guy. He lived in Northwest Washington. We were together. We did our MBAs together. Super sharp, awesome guy. Taught me a lot about culture and some of my own bias and stuff like that. So it was really cool. But he said applying for jobs was such a pain in the neck, and if you got an interview going in, was just awful. Like very Arabic name, and he eventually dropped his middle name from his resume. Middle name is Hussein, and it was like right after United States, Iraq, invasion stuff, and he's just like, man, brother can't get a break anywhere. So finally he gets some looks, and he goes in for the interview, and he felt like, man, when I walk in, it's not hi, nice to meet you. It's, oh, hey, there's a Muslim guy, and it was extremely frustrating. So that's what you call like a snap judgment or a bias stereotype. And immediately in his head, the interviewer is thinking, is he going to fit here because he's whatever he's from Sudan, because he's from Sudan, because he's Muslim. They're not thinking, is he going to fit here for his knowledge, skills, and abilities, right, that actually fit the job. So it's all kinds of problems. Halo effect we get if I'm interviewing someone and they say, hey, I love to go elk hunting and my favorite football player is Cam Chancellor, then I would say, excellent, you are hired for the job. Matter of fact, you're my new boss, because clearly they're great. So a halo effect is related to kind of similar to me bias. It means one positive thing outweighed everything else. The opposite of that, of course, is Horn's effect, where one negative thing kind of outweighs everything else. Cultural noise, obviously, is a multicultural environment, certainly in the United States, but in many ways globally. And that is when you come in, all I hear is your accent, or all I see is your burqa, or all I see is something that's reflective of culture, and I can't get beyond that in my head. So we like to train managers in this. Does that mean they have an hour training and they're good to go? No, of course not. That's why you usually have an HR person involved throughout the entire procedure, if of course you actually have one. Background investigations, can we do them? Yes, we can. Should we do them? Absolutely, depending on the job. So if you're hiring someone to work in a nursery or a child care center, yes, you better freaking do the background checks. If you're hiring someone who's going to be a delivery driver, yeah, you might want to know how many DUIs they've had. Like these things matter. There's a lot of different ways that you can do it. How I do it, if companies call me and they want a background check, is a firm I use in California, and I say, here's the information. The candidate signs a consent, says, yes, I know you're gonna check my background, and they go to state jurisdictions, federal databases, everything, and send me everything they have on the person that's related to that job. We don't just get everything on the person's life. You go, okay, for this job, these are the things that are most related. I'm hiring an accountant. I want to know what their credit score is. If they can't handle their money, they can't handle my money. Stuff like that. So job specific as much as possible. Drug tests, you want to list these on the application. So if someone fills out the application, they know that they're snorting cocaine on the weekends, and they see there's going to be a drug test here, then they can just pass, and you don't waste your time and money going through that process. Two big reasons that we do background investigations. Number one, negligent hiring. You guys remember the civil rights laws in 1964 I talked about? It's really scary because it carries what's called punitive damages, meaning punishment. If you discriminate, you're not just going to get sued for back pay and reinstatement. You're going to get sued, and there'll be punishment involved, sometimes into the millions of dollars. Not always, not often actually, but sometimes. So negligent hiring is basically when you hired someone that you shouldn't have. You knew, or in most cases, should have known not to hire that person, and you did. The person with 3 DUIs, UPS hires them, and they're drunk driving a UPS truck and they kill a family. That's coming back on UPS, A, morally, ethically, and that HR person and manager is going to have to sleep at night knowing that a family is dead because of their employee. And B, it's coming back on UPS in terms of a lawsuit because they knew or should have known this driver had a history of DUIs. So that's negligent hiring. It's one of the reasons we do background checks, especially in jobs that carry risk. Negligent retention, this is when you didn't fire somebody that you should have fired. So here's an example. Someone's doing meth on the weekends, they drive a forklift, they come to work, they hurt somebody. You send them home, we do an investigation, it was an accident, you bring them back to work, and you never drug test them. On their first day back, they run over somebody at the forklift and kill them. That's negligent retention. You knew or should have known. You should have drug tested. You should have checked criminal background. You knew or should have known the person shouldn't be working there. Two things that freak us out, both in terms of protection of our employees and their families, but also in terms, of course, of lawsuits coming back at us. That's why we want to select well and do our homework on background investigations, including reference calls. Siren release, we got the, yeah, we said both of those. Excellent. Yes, we said both of those too. Hey, glad I was on it today. Okay. Medical examinations and inquiries, just put it on the application. One of the first things the employee should know if they're filling out an application or submitting their resume is that any offer of employment will be conditional on a fill in the blank. What is it? It's conditional on a drug test, conditional on a evaluation of some kind, whatever it is. If you test somebody for illegal drugs, and I use the word illegal in quotes because we do live in Washington here, some mix-ups between Washington and Washington, D.C. But if you test someone for illegal drugs and they test positive and they go, no, I promise it was poppy seed muffins, it was the medication I'm on, it was, whatever, we can let them test again. The policy that I recommend, there's no hard and fast rule. If someone fails a drug test and we have a zero tolerance policy, okay, I'll go, okay, I'll pay for one more. If they were my top candidate, I'll pay for one more. If they fail that one, I'll be like, no, it's on you. Now I'm going to need to see 3 drug tests once a month over the next 3 months that are all clean before I'd consider hiring you. Failed twice. Your analysis are about 95% accurate. Are there some ways to have drugs in your system and pass those tests? Of course there are. Are there ways to test out those ways? Of course there are. So when you go to a lab, it costs you about an extra $5. You just say, for these urinalysis, I want to pay the extra money for an adulterants or dilution test. And that sniffs out about, I don't know, 90% or more of the ways that people get around it. This is a fun area. We might do some work on this later in the quarter because in Washington, it's recreational cannabis is legal. So someone's like, I was smoking weed on Saturday, no big deal, showed up for work on Monday, and my business, usually, if there's any kind of safety issues, they'll have a zero tolerance drug policy, and it'll be enforced in random drug tests, and I would argue as they should because people's lives and well-being are at stake. And someone says, hey, I was smoking weed on Saturday, and I went in on Monday, and there was an accident, so they drug tested everyone that was around the accident, and so they fired me. That's legal. I wasn't on work time. I was home. It's legal in Washington State, etc., etc. I feel it's a legislative challenge. I mean, I feel for that person. Like, yeah, I get it. You're kind of operating within the bounds of the law, but from an organizational risk assessment perspective, and I'm pretty conservative about risk to the company, especially when it involves, I got 4 little kids, right? It involves families getting hurt, getting affected that way. And if someone says there's no way that the smoking weed on Saturday affected me having an accident on the forklift on Monday, my response back to them is, I don't give a crap. There was THC in your body, in your system, and your assessment on whether it did or didn't affect you is irrelevant because that family knows you have a zero tolerance drug policy. That person had THC in their system and there was an accident. I don't care if you were high or not. The guy's laying in the hospital doesn't care if you were high or not. It was there. So because of that, you've put the company at risk. So it really is, I mean, it's an ethical challenge. It's a legal challenge. Hopefully they'll get it worked out someday, whatever it's going to be. But I do get the question a lot. In Washington State, can an employer fire you if you test positive for THC, which is right, the active ingredient in marijuana? And the answer, of course, is yes. They can do that. What if I have a green card? What if it's for medical? It still doesn't matter. There's certain accommodations you might make. I'm imagining, I'm guessing here, I don't know. If someone asked me this question as a consultant, hey, we have a university in Central Washington, and there's a psychology professor. We have a zero tolerance policy. The psychology professor who has glaucoma, and they smoke marijuana or use some kind of tincture, whatever, THC, to deal with that pain. I would, in my head, I'd be like, that's a reasonable accommodation, right? If we can ensure things like driving to work, are they in walking distance, other safety stuff. But for in the classroom, in my head anyway, that's probably fine. If someone is a pilot and they say, I have a green card, medical use of marijuana, I don't give a crap. You're flying a plane 30,000 feet in the air at 500 miles an hour. I don't care how many medical cards you have. There's too much at stake there. So we balance risk with right to privacy often. And we don't always make friends when we do that, because we're balancing the safety and the well-being of our employees with the financial and reputation security of the firm, with that individual's just freedom and a right to their own privacy. So it's tough but fun. It makes the job awesome. You get to do all kinds of stuff. All right, so you finally found the person. Okay, you did your personality tests and you got your selection predictors and you went through your interviews and you got down to that one person and they passed a drug test. You got great references and the background checks were all clean. Sweet, you ready to make your move as a company. Don't do things over email and text, because you want to make sure there's clarity in communication. Matter of fact, side note, the rest of your life, if it's important, don't do it over text or email. You can thank me for that later, maybe. When you make the job offer, give it over the telephone. That's usually best, because when you call them in face to face, it can even be some awkward pressure, but phone is what's normal. A formalized letter outlining whatever you said in the telephone call is then sent to the applicant. Usually it's a PDF scanned. You send them over email. You can do a hard copy if you want, but you don't have to. Your offer document. So what the candidate sees when you say, hey, we want to offer this per hour or your annual salary, and see benefits package attached and this many days off, and under this offer is contingent under these conditions, etc. You want it to be reviewed by some kind of legal counsel or somebody who knows what they're talking about, and that's to avoid creating a written contract. Like, we're going to give you this. You have all kinds of fine print in there. It's like the iPhone's user agreement, right? You know, this isn't a guarantee of employment. It's employment at will and contingent on these tests and probationary periods and all that stuff in there, so you don't end up creating a contract and you shoot yourself in the foot. Okay, last slide. Make the job offer. What you want back from them is a signed acceptance letter for that offer, and then you file it. You got it. And as soon as they start work, 72 hours, document they are who they say they are, and work authorization in the United States. Then begin onboarding. All the required trainings, which we'll get to, safety trainings, which we'll get to, job orientation, which we'll get to. Everything begins. This is when the fun begins at that point. So that's chapter 7. That'll do it.